It's December 1961, out in Colorado Springs. There's this ordinary bus, right? But it crashes on an icy road near Peterson Airfield, gets delayed.
Right.
So when it finally gets to the airfield, suddenly military personnel are everywhere. They quickly move all the airfield workers into hangars, lock the doors.
Wow. Okay. Lockdown.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But some guys peek out, and they see this bus with blacked-out windows pull up to an Air Force plane. And about 15 men get out, described later by a student pilot as Oriental soldiers in combat uniforms. They board the plane, and it takes off.
Just like that.
Just like that. Then an Army officer comes out and tells the employees, look, talking about this is a federal offense. Don't say a word.
Uh-oh. Too late, though, right?
Way too late. They had already called the local papers. The story breaks. A New York Times reporter calls the Pentagon, and it goes right up to the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara.
McNamara himself.
Yep. He steps in, kills his doc. The story calls it top secret national security.
Yeah.
But not before he tells the reporter, kind of off the record, who those men were.
Let me guess.
Tibetans.
Tibetans, yeah. That incredible scene was really just one tiny crack letting light onto this huge, very secret story from the Cold War.
Exactly.
And that's what we're digging into today, this hidden history of the CIA secretly backing the Tibetan Chushi Gangdruk resistance against the Chinese People's Liberation Army, the PLA. It went on for what? Nearly 20 years, from 56 to 74.
That's right. And our mission here, for you listening, is to really peel back all those layers. You know, the official secrecy, the cultural stuff underneath. We want to help you get not just what happened, but the why and the how.
Yeah, what does this whole episode, this unique fight, tell us about history, about power, and maybe most importantly about how vital it is to understand different perspectives?
It's fascinating.
There's actually a Tibetan proverb. It goes something like, an unspoken word has freedom, a spoken word has none.
That fits perfectly.
Doesn't it? It really gets at what secrecy is. Secrets aren't just about hiding things. Their power, their value, comes from who you share them with and when. It's a form of control, a way to manage knowledge and power.
So when you put Tibet, this image of, mystical Shangri-La together with the CIA, the ultimate symbol of secrets and covert ops.
It's just this, irresistible mix, right? As our sources say, two 20th century icons of forbidden mystery and intrigue. It grabs you.
And this whole thing had to be secret from the start, didn't it? The resistance, it didn't begin with the CIA.
No, not at all. It actually started as these separate uprisings, just regular people, pushing back against Chinese rule, which was getting more and more oppressive.
Really grassroots.
Totally. And then these groups kind of came together, evolved into this volunteer army, the Chushi Gangdruk army. They fought inside Tibet first, and then later, pretty cleverly, from this base in Mustang, which is technically in Nepal.
So given how hush-hush the whole operation was, it makes sense that we didn't hear much about it for ages.
Absolutely. Information suppression was just part of the deal. But to really get it, you have to go back to the beginning, how the resistance even started.
Right. So the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, and the PLA, they moved into Tibet around 1949, 1950.
Yeah. And at first, maybe the changes weren't so drastic, but that didn't last long. Pretty soon, sweeping changes started coming down, stripping power from local leaders, both, regular officials and religious figures. It really shook things up, especially in Kham in eastern Tibet.
And that's when people started pushing back.
That's when the protests really kicked off. Khampa villagers, ordinary people, started rising up. And often these were organized by the very families and monastery leaders the Chinese were trying to sideline.
So the attempts to control actually backfired in a way.
You could say that. As things got worse, people started moving west towards Lhasa, the capital. Leaders from different parts of Kham got together and decided, okay, let's unite, let's bring all our separate fighters into one volunteer army.
And that became the Chushi Gangdruk.
Exactly. Named after the 4 rivers and 6 ranges of their homeland, Kham, they had this big inaugural ceremony June 16th, 1958, just south of Lhasa.
What was that like? The ceremony?
Oh, it was apparently quite something. Lots of symbolism. A cavalry parade carrying a photo of the Dalai Lama in procession. And they unveiled their new flag.
What was on the flag?
It had 2 swords, like deity swords, with a thunderbolt and lotus flowers on the handles, all on a yellow background, yellow for Buddhism.
Wow. And how big was this army?
About 5,000 volunteers initially, and they had a structure, commanders, liaison officers, captains for every 10 soldiers, broken down into 37 units based on their home districts.
Organized, and I heard they had a code of conduct, too.
Yeah, a pretty detailed one. 27 rules. Things like no stealing, no rape, don't go into houses when you're on a mission, don't harm innocent people. Basic stuff, but important.
And wasn't there something about bandits?
Yes, that's a crucial detail. The code specifically said soldiers had to protect locals from bandits. And the reason that was so important
Was because the Chinese were using bandits.
exactly, paying them to dress up like Chushi, Gangdruk soldiers and terrorize villages, trying to make the resistance look bad.
That's incredible. What about rewards? Was there a merit system?
There was, like, supposedly a 500 Indian rupee prize if you captured a Chinese officer's stuff, especially documents. Though, some veterans later said those rewards were maybe more theory than practice.
Okay, so this army forms, but it wasn't happening in total isolation, right? There were other efforts.
Right. International resistance was already cooking. After China and Tibet signed that 17-point agreement back in 51, some high-ranking Tibetans, including the Dalai Lama's older brother, Gyalo Thondup, went to India. They talked to Prime Minister Nehru.
And what did Nehru advise?
He apparently encouraged them to start a people's democratic movement. So back in Lhasa, they formed the Mimang Sogpa, the People's Party. They protested things like the Dalai Lama having to go to China in 54, put up posters calling for resistance.
So the pressure was building internally and externally.
Definitely. And by 1956, things in Kham were getting really bad. Monasteries were being bombed. The Mimang Sogpa staged public protests, even gave a letter straight to the Chinese authorities saying, basically, get out of Tibet.
How did the Chinese react?
They demanded arrests. And that was kind of the breaking point. Tibetans realized, okay, we can't do this alone. We need help from outside.
And that's where Gyalo Thondup comes back in.
Exactly. Compa traders went to him asking for military aid. What they didn't know was that the Americans, the CIA, had actually already approached him about the situation.
Ah, so the pieces were starting to come together. Secretly.
Precisely. It was the summer of 56 when the CIA's Far East Division made the call. Okay, let's support this Tibetan resistance movement.
So let's talk about that U.S.-Tibet relationship. It sounds complicated.
Oh, it is. Fascinatingly complex. After China went communist in 49, suddenly the U.S. was very interested in Tibet.
Geopolitics, right? World War strategy.
Absolutely. From the U.S. point of view, Tibet was suddenly really important. A way to counter China, maybe help relations with India and Pakistan. A key spot on the Asian chessboard.
Our sources call Tibet a pawn on the imperial chessboard.
Yeah. And the Tibetans themselves, orphans of the Cold War, it captures that sense of being caught up in something much bigger, maybe not entirely of their own making.
But despite that sort of cold, strategic view from the top, there were personal connections being made on the ground.
There really were. You hear these stories, like from retired CIA officers, Tony Poe, for example, who trained Tibetans. He said they were the best men I worked with. Real respect there.
And the Tibetans.
They remembered their American instructors fondly, too. Called them good people, Miyagpo Red, in Tibetan. So, genuine mutual admiration on a personal level.
But there's always a but.
There's a big but. Underneath all that good feeling, there were some really fundamental misunderstandings. And these had huge consequences for the whole operation.
What was the core misunderstanding?
Well, number one, the U.S. goal was mainly about stopping communism spreading. It wasn't really about a long-term, deep commitment to Tibetan independence, not in the way the Tibetans hoped.
Okay, differing objectives.
And maybe even more critical, the CIA just didn't seem to grasp how incredibly important regional loyalties and identities were within Tibet.
Which raises that question you mentioned earlier. How much does actually understanding the culture impact these kinds of interventions, even when everyone seems to be on the same side, roughly speaking?
Exactly. It's a huge question because that lack of understanding wasn't just academic, it had real-world effects.
So how did that play out, this failure to get the regional dynamics?
Well, a few ways. For starters, U.S. intelligence just didn't have great info on Tibet overall. They were leaning hard on British sources, apparently, and those tended to focus on Lhasa, the capital, and kind of glossed over how different the regions were.
And the main contact person, Gyalo Thondup.
Yeah, he was the key liaison, but he was from Amdo in the Northeast. He wasn't always, let's say, totally in sync with the Kampa ways of doing things, their structures of authority.
And a language barrier.
Huge problem. Only one CIA officer actually spoke any Tibetan. Imagine trying to run a complex, covert operation with that kind of communication gap.
Oof. You can see how things could go wrong, did they?
They absolutely did. tragically wrong. The CIA, despite liking the soldiers, they actually overruled suggestions to organize operations based on these natural, regional, native place allegiances.
Why would they do that?
Probably thinking in terms of standard military organization, maybe not trusting those local ties. Whatever the reason, in one awful case, they sent this really skilled guerrilla unit into an area where they had no local connections, despite the unit protesting. They were ambushed by the Chinese, almost the entire unit wiped out, just one survivor, because they didn't have the local support network they needed.
Devastating. And you mentioned clashes over rank, too.
Yeah, another disconnect. The CIA used a military-style ranking, based on what you achieve. But Tibetan society, especially in Kham, often relied more on ascribed status, who your family was, established social position. So the CIA system just didn't mesh well with the existing power dynamics.
So the resistance, even while working with the CIA, kind of maintained its own internal logic based on these regional ties.
Exactly, which brings us right into those internal dynamics. Before 1959, you got to remember, Tibet wasn't one monolithic state. It was more like a patchwork. Lhasa, under the Dalai Lama, had authority, but places like Kham had a lot of autonomy.
And Kham itself wasn't unified either.
Not at all. It was made up of over 30 distinct districts, Fayul, they called them, each with its own way of doing things, its own dialect, its own loyalties. And yes, sometimes feuding, even banditry was part of the picture.
So the Chushi Gangdruk army reflected that reality, the Eastern Tibetan reality, more than Lhasa's structure.
Precisely. The guerrilla units were built around those native place connections. Guys from the same district fought together, and their leaders, often the same people who were leaders back home, from important families, successful traders.
Who was the overall leader then? You mentioned Androg Gampotashi.
Yeah, he was considered the supreme leader, a respected trader from Lithang in Kham. And interestingly, his authority wasn't really questioned, even though some other leaders might have had technically a higher social standing.
And Gyalo Thondup, the Dalai Lama's brother, where did he fit in the soldiers' eyes?
Okay, so the U.S. saw him as the chief architect because he was their main contact and had high status. But for the soldiers on the ground, they respected him hugely, saw him as this crucial patron figure who was managing the American aid, which was vital. But he wasn't really seen as their direct military commander day to day.
They still recognized Gampotashi's leadership and those sort of horizontal district-based loyalties.
Exactly. The resistance really saw itself as pretty autonomous, not really under the thumb of the U.S. or the Tibetan government in exile, for that matter. Remember, it started before the U.S. got involved.
And that autonomy is key. And it showed up later, too, right? After the Dalai Lama fled Tibet in 59.
Definitely. Many Chushi gang drug fighters ended up in India, and they weren't happy. They were being put to work building roads. So they organized this big meeting in Gangtok, India. Over 200 leaders, maybe 3,000 soldiers.
What came out of that meeting?
It was huge. They made 3 key decisions. 1, appoint representatives to the Dalai Lama's new government in exile. 2, set up military operations in Mustang, Nepal, that secret base we mentioned. And 3, formally accept U.S. aid, choosing it over an offer from Taiwan.
So that meeting really re-energized everything.
Totally revitalized them, and it cemented this lasting, positive feeling towards the U.S. for many of those involved, despite all the complexities.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about intelligence and maybe different ideas about what's actually valuable. There's an amazing story about some captured documents.
Ah, yes, the commander's pouch. November 1961, CIA Director Alan Dulles walks into this high-level National Security Council meeting, and he's carrying this pouch, Chinese Army commander's pouch, apparently blood-stained, bullet holes in it.
Dramatic interest.
Right, and inside. Over 1,600 classified Chinese documents. Dulles called it an intelligence goldmine. The sources say it was maybe the best intelligence coup since the Korean War.
Wow. So what made them so valuable to the U.S.?
Well, think about it. This was a time when the U.S. knew very, very little about what was actually happening inside communist China. These documents basically blew the lid off the Great Leap Forward.
Mao's big economic push.
Which turned out to be a total disaster. The documents showed catastrophic famine, huge problems inside the Chinese military, internal party conflicts, just invaluable intel.
And for the Tibetan government in exile, were the documents useful to them too?
Immensely. They provided concrete proof of atrocities. One horrifying statistic that came out was that over 87,000 Tibetans had been killed just in the Lhasa area between March 59 and September 60. That kind of evidence was crucial for making their case internationally about human rights violations.
Okay, so massive value for Washington, massive value for the government in exile.
Yeah.
What about the soldiers who actually captured the documents?
And this is where it gets really interesting. For them, apparently kind of meh.
Really? After risking their lives?
Yeah. We have quotes from veterans, like Lobsang Jampa. He said something like, "The documents were very useful to us, but I don't know what they were about."
Huh.
Another guy, Wang Yao Lama, said, "Nobody knew what the contents of those documents were. At that time, questions weren't asked. If you asked too many questions, others would be suspicious of you."
So hold on. The CIA thinks it's a gold mine, the government in exile sees proof of atrocities, and the soldiers who got them are like, yeah, papers, whatever.
Pretty much. And look at the reward. The CIA gave General Baba Yeshi, who was running the Mustang base, an Omega watch, a fancy chronograph. Clearly, the Americans thought this is a high-value reward for high-value intel.
Makes sense from their perspective.
But here's the twist. Many of these Kampa soldiers, they were former traders. They knew markets, they knew quality, and apparently they found a lot of the American-supplied stuff, including watches sometimes, to be kind of
Sheep?
yeah, cheap quality, as they put it. They had, quote, discriminatory tastes. They weren't easily impressed by just any gadget.
So what did they value, if not the intel or the watches?
What they really wanted, fundamentally, was to get Tibet back under the Dalai Lama's rule, to go home. Those documents, however important to diplomats or spies, were just abstract, a minor win compared to the ultimate goal.
That difference in perspective is just stark, isn't it? What one side sees as a gold mine, the other sees as, well, less valuable than maybe a good quality watch they could trade, or just irrelevant compared to liberation.
It really highlights that core disconnect we talked about. Different motivations, different understandings of value.
Okay, so let's talk about that Mustang base, the Low Army. What were they actually doing there?
Mustang was strategically brilliant. It's this little kingdom tucked inside Nepal right on the border with Tibet. So the Low Army used it as a base for raids back into Tibet during the summer months. Guerrilla stuff, gathering intelligence.
And the U.S. kept supporting this.
Yeah, financially and with supply airdrops right up until 1969. And even after the U.S. money stopped, the operations actually kept going for another 5 years on their own steam.
Incredible resilience. What about India? Were they involved beyond just letting refugees in?
Oh, much more involved than was publicly known for a long time. India wasn't just aware, they were active participants. Their intelligence agency, the CIB, trained Tibetans. And then during the border war with China in '62...
The Sino-Indian War.
Right. India formed this all-Tibetan unit within its own army, the Special Frontier Force, or SFF, sometimes called Establishment 22, and its stated goal, explicitly, was to restore independence to Tibet.
Wow. So India was directly supporting Tibetan independence aims militarily.
At that point, yes. And interestingly, in the 70s, the trainers and gear for the SFF actually shifted from American to Soviet.
Geopolitics make strange bedfellows. Did the SFF see action?
They did. Significantly, in the 1971 war between India and East Pakistan, what became Bangladesh, 56 Tibetan soldiers were killed and hundreds were decorated for bravery. A heavy price.
So the Mustang operation eventually ended, though. How did that happen?
It was pretty dramatic and ultimately sad. By 1974, China was putting serious pressure on Nepal. Nepal, which had kind of quietly allowed the base for years, publicly denounced the fighters as bandits.
Even though they knew better privately.
Right. So Nepal sent its army to shut the base down. The Tibetan soldiers were faced with fighting the Nepalese army. They didn't want to do that.
What stopped them?
The Dalai Lama. He sent a taped message, delivered by his brother-in-law, basically pleading with them to surrender peacefully rather than fight fellow Buddhists, the Nepalese. Out of deep respect and deference to him, they laid down their arms.
A painful decision, I imagine.
Had to be. And the aftermath wasn't great. The organization split, leaders were jailed, fighters ended up in refugee camps. One leader even tried a desperate escape later and was killed.
But the organization, Chushi Gangdruk, it didn't just disappear.
No, that's what's really interesting. The military wing in Mustang ended, yes. But Chushi Gangdruk continued as a social and political organization. They kept offices running, first in Darjeeling, then Delhi, Dharamsala, and the veterans in Nepal. They formed their own association.
Let's support each other.
Exactly. And get this, they fund pensions for veterans through their own business ventures. Not money from the U.S., not from the Tibetan government in exile. They maintained that autonomy.
That's remarkable. Adapting from a military force to a social support network, self-funded, shows incredible commitment.
It really does. Goes way beyond just the years of CIA funding.
So why did this whole story stay secret for so long? I mean, beyond the obvious covert nature.
Well, several reasons. You have the clandestine nature of guerrilla war and spying itself. Then there's the whole complex international political scene during the Cold War. Nobody wanted to officially admit what they were doing. And Tibet's own goal, independence, was always politically sensitive.
And governments were actively denying things.
Oh, yeah. The U.S. released info very slowly, drip by drip, over decades. Nepal kept up official denials about the Mustang base for years, even though they privately helped the Tibetans.
And even India's role took a long time to come out, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't there some nuclear scare?
Yes, that was wild. It wasn't until 1978 that rumors started flying about pollution in the Ganges River. It forced this incredible admission. Back in 1965, India and the U.S. had run these secret joint operations,
Doing what?
trying to place nuclear-powered surveillance devices high up on Nanda Devi, a mountain in the Himalayas, to monitor Chinese nuclear tests.
Nuclear devices, like plutonium.
Exactly, plutonium-239. And during one attempt, they lost one, a 33-pound plutonium pack. Just lost. Possibly swept away by an avalanche, maybe ended up somewhere in the Ganges watershed.
That is terrifying. A secret Cold War operation potentially poisoning a major river system.
It's a stark reminder of the risks and the secrecy involved. But despite all this secrecy, the intelligence the Tibetans gathered was genuinely important for the U.S., wasn't it?
Absolutely vital. They provided ground-level details on the Chinese Army's capabilities, on how bad things really were inside China during the Great Leap Forward, confirming the descent and failures. And crucial data on China's early nuclear tests at Lop Nor, stuff the U.S. desperately needed.
But for the Tibetan community itself, this history isn't just about spies and intel coup.
No, not at all. For them, it's much more personal. It's stories passed down, memories of national service, of armed struggle, of fighting for their homeland, their identity.
Yet, paradoxically, this armed struggle, this Chushi Gangdruk movement, isn't always front and center in the official story Tibet tells about itself.
Right. Often the focus in the main narrative is more on diplomatic efforts or nonviolent resistance, which are also hugely important parts of the story, of course.
But it means this specific chapter, the armed resistance, gets somewhat sidelined. Our sources use terms like historical arrest or subjugated knowledges.
Meaning these regional histories, these alternative narratives, get kind of pushed down in favor of a more unified, maybe simpler national story.
Yeah, and the experiences of these specific soldiers, the Kampas, who formed the backbone of Chushi Gangdruk, their part of the story doesn't always get the full recognition it might deserve within the broader Tibetan historical narrative.
So wrapping this deep dive up, what's the big takeaway for you?
For me, it's how much this story shows that huge global conflicts like the Cold War aren't just about superpowers and strategies drawn on maps. They're deeply, deeply affected by what's happening on the ground, by local cultures, ancient allegiances, what individual people and communities actually believe in and are willing to fight for.
And the massive misunderstandings that can happen when those ground-level realities aren't fully grasped by the bigger powers involved.
Precisely. The resistance saw an immediate threat right there in their villages and monasteries. The U.S. saw a global fight against communism. Sometimes those aligned, often they didn't, or valued different outcomes.
It really makes you, our listener, think, doesn't it? How much does culture, individual belief, personal loyalty shape these huge geopolitical events? And maybe what other official histories are out there that are missing these crucial human pieces?
Yeah, how many other subjugated knowledges are waiting to be uncovered that could totally change how we understand historical events or even current ones?
It suggests that if we really want to get a handle on today's complex world, we can't just look at governments and official statements.
We have to look deeper, embrace that ground-level human experience, the messy, complicated, often contradictory stories of the people actually living through these events. That's where the real understanding often lies.
A fascinating, complex, and often tragic story. Thanks for walking us through it.
Absolutely. Lots to think about there.